So good morning. We'll slowly allow people to filter in, but just to say welcome to this month's Simon Talk, where we're going to be looking at the issue of youth homelessness. I'm delighted to be joined here by Kate Polson and Sinéad Healy. Kate is the Executive Director of the Rock Trust in Scotland. She's been working in the homeless sector for over 25 years, delivering and leading homeless and youth services. Works included the creation of a national network of youth runaways mobile service for sex workers, specialist services for older men and veterans who find themselves homeless, and street-based services for young people. For the last 13 years, she's been working as the Chief Executive of the Rock Trust, Scotland's Youth Homelessness Charity. Rock Trust aims to end youth homelessness by designing services, improving systems to ensure that young people have the services that they need to avoid, resolve and move on from homelessness. Kate is chair of the Every Youth and leads on the youth work stream of the Housing First European Hub. She also chairs Away Home Scotland, a national coalition to end youth homelessness by the Rock Trust. Away Home Scotland developed and continued to support the implementation of youth homeless prevention pathways with the Scottish Government, and that's a big part of what Kate is going to talk to us today about. Sinéad, who I'll introduce again when it's her turn to speak, is Assistant Principal in the Department of Housing and has also been very involved in the rollout and development, indeed, of the Youth Homelessness Strategy here in Ireland. So this is an opportunity maybe to reflect on what's happening in Scotland, and for Kate, Sinéad, sorry, to give us an update on where we are and the Youth Homelessness Strategy, but also to offer that reflection to Scotland as well and give us the local context. So I'm really looking forward to today's chat. I hope you are too. Just to say, if you do use social media and want to tweet or Facebook or whatever you do, please do use the hashtag Simon Talks. And also to say once Kate has done her presentation, I'll invite Sinéad to give a response and talk to us about the Youth Homelessness Strategy in Ireland. Then we'll open it out for Q&A. So there's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You'll find a Q&A and a chat box. If you want to post your questions in there, and do it in real time, we'll hold the questions to the end, but if a question occurs that you want answered or you think is interesting, do pop it in as you think of it, or hold to the end, whatever works best for you, and we'll take the questions then at the end. And feel free to add more than one question if you're so. Okay, with that, I'm going, with my grateful thanks, I'm going to hand over to Kate, who's take it from there.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me along this morning. I hope you can all hear me. And now I'm going to try and share my screen, so wish me luck. Hopefully you're now all seeing my presentation, I hope. I'm very aware that how we count homelessness in Ireland and Scotland is quite different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and reflect on that, but then give a bit of input as to what we do here and what we're doing here to end youth homelessness. First off, I'd just like to say that we need to recognise that youth homelessness is not inevitable. So what we shouldn't be doing is purely offering responses to it in a crisis stage. If we really want to end it, we need to make sure that it is rare, brief and non-recurring, and that's what we need to be aiming our services to address. But I think a big part of this is we need to acknowledge that youth homelessness is different to that of adults. It's different in its causes, and it's different in its experience and its consequence. And young people are different by nature in terms of how they see risk, in terms of their experience and their networks and support available to them. So not just around the age and stage of development, but actually around the resilience that's been built at such a young age. I think we need to also acknowledge that young people are doubly disadvantaged. So they're disadvantaged in both the labour market and the housing market, because they're more likely to have insecure, low-paid work, 0-hour contracts, but also in the housing market, because they don't have references for houses quite often, and they certainly don't have the access to deposits and the kind of resources that you might need to access the private sector. So we know that they're doubly disadvantaged. But also, we really need to respond to young people with youth-specific services. There's not a lot of walks in life where you expect a 16-year-old to access the same services in the same way as a 60-year-old. I don't think we should expect that just because young people become homeless. In Scotland, about 10% of our population is under 25, is between 16 and 25. However, about 25% of our homeless population is in that age bracket. We know that young people who've experienced local authority care, who've been looked after by the state, are really high in terms of the proportion of them in that homeless population as well. But across Scotland, apart from the national figures, now to be clear, here I've noted that 38,000 registered as legally homeless. Now that is, they're accepted, that there is a statutory duty, so they're legally homeless. That's not everyone that presents and prevention actions taken, and it's not everyone who's not deemed to be legally homeless, so there's much higher numbers, but that's an annual figure, so that is presenting each year. It's quite different across each local authority, and when we see the numbers each year coming out, we can see where homelessness is increasing or decreasing in terms of who is presenting that year. And the big issue we have at the moment is actually how long people are homeless for. So that number is not a number that changes each year anymore, where people are spending much more time in homeless accommodation and support, and therefore much more time in insecure housing. And so the number homeless at any one time is actually getting bigger. However, over the last few years, we are seeing a reduction in the youngest homeless people. So in terms of the 16+ age group, we are seeing that the younger bit of the 16 to 25 age group is reducing, although we still do have an issue. We see slightly more female than male young people becoming homeless, and we have some children and families amongst that group. But we also know that at least half of them have a support need. So we know that we need to offer that support. We also record in Scotland where somebody becomes homeless from, so the last place they were accommodated. And of course, there are some young people who are presenting as homeless having come out of supported accommodation, but actually the majority of them were living with family, friends and partners before becoming homeless. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense about the issue we have in Scotland. The Rock Trust, we've been around for about 30 years now. We were originally started to offer an interim housing for young people who were at that time being given council housing predominantly, which they weren't prepared or supported to live in, and therefore became homeless quite quickly again and spent time sleeping in graveyards. And so we were created to provide that interim support for young people. But 30 years later, things have changed quite a bit, and so has our service range and our aims. However, our aims remain very similar in that we want to make sure that young people avoid, resolve and move on from homelessness. Now, when we talk about ending youth homelessness, some people still speak like it is an inevitable thing, and it really isn't. But we realise that as a youth homelessness organisation, we can provide advice and housing and all of the support, but actually it takes more than housing and homelessness to solve this. And actually what we tend to focus on, we as a sector tend to focus on, is the crisis part of that. So in Scotland, over the last actually 20 years since the Rough Sleepers Initiative, we've been building more and more temporary models of housing that are anything from emergency for a few days or 28 days up to more supported, which might last up to 2 years, but certainly it's been focused on the crisis work. So we have street-based services offering advice and outreach. We have drop-in services offering shower and food. We have shelter services. So really have been putting a lot of effort into making sure that our services respond to crisis. And therefore that's where the funding and the effort has gone. And I think over the last 10 years or so, we've really been working to try and increase the prevention and support sides of that system to make sure that we're shrinking that crisis response. And I think for us, that's what ending homelessness looks like. It's about having a lot of effort in the prevention, and then at the other end, maintaining successful housing, so that we can shrink down the crisis services, which means that young people, if they do, it should be rare that they become homeless, but if they do, it should be short, very brief, and it should be in suitable accommodation. But the efforts are to move people on into permanent, stable housing with all the support they need to maintain it, so that they can move on. And for young people, when we think about what homelessness and housing looks like, we want to try and give young people the same experience as their non-homeless peers. So most young people under 25 will share with peers or will live at home with family. And so that's the type of housing we want to offer. But in addition to that, offering housing first, to make sure that young people have whatever support they need. Now, to do this, because we're a youth homelessness organisation, we knew that it was more than housing and homelessness. So we formed a coalition called Away Home Scotland, and it brought together people from housing, health, education, youth work, justice, across the piece, really, looking at how we could bring people together in a way that would help us prevent homelessness in the first place. And as a coalition, what we decided to do was a focus on prevention on 3 strands. We wanted to ensure there were broad population-based approaches, targeted strategies for people at risk, and that also we addressed the systems that were discharging people into homelessness. So in doing that, we have to look at how we reduce poverty and its impacts, how we increase affordable housing, and how we ensure that young people can access employment opportunities with fair pay. And when we're thinking about at-risk young people, they'll often be within their families and within schools. That's where they spend most of their time. So that's where the services have to be addressing the issues. So school-based programmes, family mediation and support, but also support for marginalised groups. So we know in Scotland, the LGBT young people tend to be overrepresented in the numbers as well. So we're making sure that our service responds to that, the needs of that group. In terms of system prevention, we actually have really supportive legislation and policy in Scotland for young people in care and leaving care. However, there seems to be a cliff edge when it comes to housing, and we see a lot of young people either become homeless straight from care, or sometime afterwards the housing offered is unsuitable for them. So we need to make sure that the systems in place for leaving institutions, whether that is prison care or hospital, are suitable and supportive for young people. So that was what the coalition focused on. But by bringing together professionals across the piece, we looked at a much bigger programme of prevention. And we developed 2 youth homelessness prevention pathways. We did this with all those partners and with the Scottish Government at a national strategic level, used all of the evidence that we had available. And we decided that actually what we needed to do was implement the policies we already had, not create new policies, but look at service strategies and response strategies, bringing together education and family support to make sure that prevention was properly delivered. So we're still working on implementing these pathways right now, but I'm sure you'll have seen the prevention models that we're talking about, and it's the 5-tier model. So looking at everything from the universal prevention right through to the emergency and recovery. But the idea is that if we're really focusing on prevention, and if that's where we're putting all our efforts, all our funding and all our resource, then that should have a big impact. And we're already seeing that having an impact in Scotland. We created the pathways, which are available actually on the website to download, but we wanted to make sure that they didn't just become another thing that wasn't implemented. So we've been working on implementation plan with the Scottish Government and meeting regularly to ensure the progress of the recommendations that we presented in the pathways, and also talking with each local authority on what they could do within their area to solve the problems that they had. And each one is slightly different depending on their housing and their economy. We established cross-departmental groups. So that was working with each local authority to build small coalition groups of different professionals that worked with young people from school age right up and right through to 25, to make sure that everyone was doing their part, because this only happens with collective. We're working collectively and collaboratively to have the impact we want to have, but ensuring that even adult services were changing the way they delivered for young people to ensure it was suitable and acknowledged the developmental needs of young people. But working really closely with each local authority and the providers within that authority to develop strategies and approaches. And that means that sometimes we are testing new models and then sharing them. It means that sometimes we are working with local authorities on their plan only and bringing partners together, but trying to make sure that we're implementing what we know is best for young people. Whilst we've been doing that, there's also been a lot of policy change in Scotland. So we've had the unsuitable accommodation order, which improves the standards of temporary accommodation, which means that young people can, not just young people, everyone can no longer be housed as part of their temporary accommodation in something like a B&B, where they don't have access to the building during the day and they don't have access to laundry and cooking facilities. So we are now moving towards improving the standards of temporary accommodation. We've also ended the local connection test, which enables people to move between authorities, whether that is to move closer to family or closer to employment or closer to where housing is available. People can now move. And this year we will see prevention duties implemented, which gives more responsibilities to any public body to make sure that, and the way it's phrased is to make sure that they ask and act on housing. So we're seeing quite a lot of change, all of which is meant to make sure that we're focused on prevention, that people can move to where the housing is, as long as the support can follow them, and that we're not putting people into forms of accommodation which will make moving on from homelessness really tricky. So hopefully then we're changing the experience people have when they become homeless. With all of this change, we know that at the moment the sector, and bigger than the homeless and housing sector, but the education and justice sector and family sector will all need training and support. So there's a programme of work taking place now. We've got lots of task and finish groups working on what that looks like. So all those changes are still being implemented now. However, for young people, we also have the promise. And that was our government's promise to all young people to ensure that they could grow up loved and nurtured. And that's young people in care and on the edges of care. So we're working with the Promise team here on how we make sure that young people in state care are not leaving into insecure housing. Prevention pathways are still being implemented, but at the beginning of this journey, each local authority built a rapid rehousing transition plan, because Scottish Government now have a policy of rapid rehousing, which includes housing first. And initially that was very focused on the traditional housing first clients who are normally entrenched long-term rough sleepers with multiple issues. They've since opened that up and included young people's prevention services and support services in the rapid rehousing transition plans. So we're seeing an increase in the number of local authorities addressing youth homelessness specifically, including prevention work in schools and immediate advice to reduce the number of young people entering into the system. The pathways, there are two. I talk about multiple, but there are two. There's one particularly for young people leaving care, and that's because they have additional legal rights already. So we thought actually we'll have something specific that just says, let's implement that properly. Our second one is for young people more generally, but those at risk. So includes young people with multiple and complex needs, young people from the LGBT community, and young people without recourse to public funds. So it addresses a much bigger group of young people, but a much more general population as well. And what we decided, and in our coalition group, with all of the evidence and knowledge that we had, was that actually we needed to have prevention interventions in schools and communities, including training and resourcing for teachers and schools. We wanted to have one-stop shops. One of the bits of feedback we had from young people is that it's really hard to know how to access housing advice or support. So having somewhere that you could go, so there was no wrong door and everyone would work together, rather than having to navigate through a lot of different services. We also recommended that there were youth-specific supports available. Youth work methods should not be lost just because somebody is homeless. We need to still allow young people that space to develop and build the resilience in their networks. I think one of the difficult things for most local authorities was to offer access to affordable housing options so that young people could complete their education and enter employment, although we're seeing some live and work style schemes and some sharing schemes now in Scotland, so that young people can access affordable housing options. One of the other things we advocated was that we had some continuation of support. So when young people are leaving care or when they hit 18, 21, all those milestone ages, there's quite often a cliff edge in what support is available to them. And we advocated that actually if young people were going through the big transition of leaving care or leaving home, they should have support throughout that transition and until they were settled, which I think matches up with the Housing First principles, but it might not necessarily be Housing First. We advocate actually that rather than big institutional responses to homelessness, that we see big hostels or B&Bs and temporary accommodation, we advocate actually that young people have the same options as their non-homeless peers. So that would normally be family-like environments through supported lodgings or night stop services, or sharing with peers, so small scale shared accommodation, or independent accommodation with all of the support required. And part of that is Housing First for Youth. We have a prevention map, and you'll see on the Away Home Scotland website, the prevention map. You can click in and you can see examples of work that's going on across Scotland that tackle each part of the prevention pathway. And we also are constantly receiving new examples of that as local authorities start to test and pilot new models, and we find new models that are successful. We keep adding to that map, and the idea is that we end up having a place to go for local authorities where they can find the information they might require in order to address the issues in their area. And sometimes what we find is a local authority has lots of young people presenting repeatedly because the accommodation they're getting isn't suitable, or there's no support into it, in which case we can point them to the right types of services that they might use or they might design to solve that issue. But often it is that they need to study actually the reasons young people are becoming homeless in their area, and if that's that can be addressed in schools or otherwise, then that's what we need to tackle. At the minute for the Rock Trust, we are launching Upstream in Scotland. It's been successfully delivered, started in Australia, but been successfully delivered in Wales. And we're now launching that across 4 local authorities. It's a bit of a test. I'm working with partners on that, but that is an in-schools survey that would allow you to assess the risk of future homelessness for young people and address it at a really early stage. So it's very, very early intervention. And it's definitely worth a look at. So if you've not heard of it before, go and find out about it and we can share more information. But if we really want to end youth homelessness, it's really important that we are taking action at the earliest possible stage and that we have the right types of accommodation available. We know that the causes of youth homelessness are, whilst the driver might be poverty, cause of it is relationship breakdown. We know that the ways out of it is affordable housing, well-paid employment, and access to the right support. And if we know all of that, and that's what the evidence has said, and that hasn't changed for years, then we really can come up with strategies for ending it. And I know that Scotland's making progress in this area, but we're still learning as well. I'm happy to answer any questions about either the work of Rock Trust or Away Home or the progress we're making in Scotland. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. That was wonderful, and you kept exactly to time, which shocked me. It kept me. No, that's not a reflection on you. It's a reflection on my experience as a chair. So I will hand over quickly to Sinead. As I said, Sinead is Assistant Principal in the Department of Housing, and she's leading on the youth homelessness strategy within the department. So with that, I'll just hand straight over to Sinead, and Sinead's going to talk a little bit about the youth homelessness strategy in Ireland, and also any reflection she has on Kate. So over to you, Sinead. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that, Wayne, and thanks to Simon Communities for inviting me to be here today. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about youth homelessness. Anna, I might just ask you to share my slides, if that's okay. I'm having some issues with sharing myself, so I'm going to see if I can get in there. Great, thanks for that, Anna. So you can see now, oh, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So I'm just going to start by giving a bit of context around the development of the Youth Homelessness Strategy. So this was a programme for government commitment. So the programme for government came out in summer 2020, and it was also followed up in our National Housing Plan, Housing for All, which was published in September 21. So that commitment to develop a youth homelessness strategy, it was done so in the context of really rapidly increasing numbers of young people accessing emergency accommodation in Ireland. So there was a 57% increase recorded in the last 5 years. So that's from about, I think, 2016 to 2021. So that's a really, really stark increase. And when we say young adults, we're talking about those aged 18 to 24. So I suppose just to give you some numbers now, about 17% of adults access emergency accommodation. Our last report was published there on Friday. So that number, they account for 17% of all adults accessing emergency accommodation. So in numbers terms, that's 1,491. So I'm just going to show you the next slide where I have set out a graph. So this is from January 2019 to July 22, and you can really see how the numbers have really significantly jumped there. They were kind of steady going up and down through the COVID period, and then around May 21 they start to climb, and unfortunately they have kind of stayed at that high since then. And moving away from the numbers and just to give you an overview of the strategy itself. So the development of this started around the time that Housing for All was published, and we started looking at what we could do in this space. So the overall strategy itself was published in November 22, and a huge focus of my section, the homelessness policy section within the department, was on developing this strategy last year. So it was published towards the end of the year. It's a 3-year strategy with 3 strategic aims. There are a total of 27 actions within the strategy, and of those 27 actions, there are 10 different action owners. So these are all the really key stakeholders. So obviously my own department, but also Department of Children, we've TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, the HSE, and then a few other government departments as well. So there's really a focus on that interagency piece and cross collaboration. So the overarching aim of the strategy is to help young people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. So when we were developing the strategy, it was really important to us that we gathered a wide range of views. So we carried out a number of consultations in the first half of last year. So we started with a public consultation, and that ran for 3 weeks, I think, in February of last year. So we received a good mix of submissions from both members of the public and organisations advocating on behalf of their clients. The second consultation that we carried out was with the local authorities. So as you know, local authorities have the statutory responsibility within Ireland to provide emergency accommodation and also services for homeless people. So it's really important to us to get the views of the local authorities. Now that consultation it was held online as well, and it was really well attended by the local authorities. And it was we got some really, really valuable feedback there on, from the people who are on the front line. They could provide really constructive feedback as to what we needed to consider and incorporate within the final strategy. Our third consultation was held with the National Homeless Action Committee. So this is a committee that was established in, I think, Q4 21. It's chaired by our minister, and all the key stakeholders involved in addressing homelessness are represented on this committee, including Simon communities. So again, really important to get their feedback. What we did with the National Homeless Action Committee was that we submitted a first draft of the strategy and sought their feedback on it, and they provided feedback as well that was really useful to us. Our fourth consultation was with the Irish Coalition to End Youth Homelessness. So this coalition was established, Wayne might correct me, but our Simon communities are members of the coalition. I think they were established in 2017. So they've been advocating for a very, very long time to have a youth homelessness strategy. So again, we had to engage with them very closely to ensure that we were capturing their views as well, and got some really valuable recommendations and some really kind of practical information from them as well. So that was very useful. The fifth consultation was with the Department of Children and TUSLA. So of course they're represented on our National Homeless Action Committee, but given their role and their responsibilities around young people, really important for us to have a separate, really focused consultation with the Department of Children and TUSLA. So that was particularly in the context of care leavers, but also kind of more generally overall in terms of young people and children who are just about to turn 18 as well. And our final consultation that we held, and we always say this is probably our most important consultation, was with young people with experiences of homelessness. So we worked with our colleagues in Department of Children to organise these consultations. They were held with 25 young people in total, all around Ireland, and it was a mix of people who were accessing emergency accommodation at the time of the consultation, but also young people who had had previous experience of accessing emergency accommodation. So there was an independent report writer hired to sit in on all these consultations, and at the end of these consultations they presented us with a report, and that captured really well the views of the young people, their experiences, the barriers and challenges they faced in exiting emergency accommodation, and they put forward as well some of their own recommendations, all of which we took on board and considered when we were developing the strategy. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the strategy, or who haven't maybe read it recently, just to give you kind of an overview of the contents of it, it's divided into two parts. So in the first part, we have our understanding youth homelessness, and that kind of sets the scene of what we want to achieve in the strategy and why we want to do it. So that sets out the context, other key strategies. We also talk a bit about stats and what existing services there are out there already. There are already so many existing services. We thought it was really important to capture that in the strategy. We also explore the causes, the experiences, the barriers. So this section was informed both by the consultations that we had held earlier in the year, but also by our own kind of desk research. And from doing that research and from holding the consultations, we were able to identify a total of 6 vulnerable cohorts. So I have a separate slide on that, so I'll go into a bit more detail on that later on in my presentation. The second part of our strategy sets out the strategic aims, actions, and implementation. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 strategic aims in total. I've set them out there. That is to prevent young people entering homelessness in the first instance, to improve the experiences of young people in emergency accommodation, and then to assist young people to exit homelessness. So we talk a bit about the strategic aims in this part of the strategy, and we also set out our 27 actions and how we're going to go about implementing those actions over the next 3 years. So as I mentioned, we have a section in part 1 of the strategy, and that's exploring the causes and barriers. And I know Kate touched on some of these, and they're very similar here in Ireland as well as in Scotland. The causes of youth homelessness: breakdown in the family home is by far the #1 cause of youth homelessness in Ireland, followed by the substance misuse, poor mental health, low income, and then access to rental market and social housing. So I noted Kate used the phrase doubly disadvantaged, which I think is a really clear, simple way of explaining it, because we talk about it a lot and we haven't actually used that term within the strategy, but it's a really good one to kind of sum up the issues that young people are facing, because by virtue of their age, they do have trouble accessing social housing, they do have trouble accessing the rental market as well. They're typically on a significantly lower income than someone who might be 10 or 15 years older. So of course, these all present challenges and may result in them entering homelessness. And I mentioned it also in terms of barriers for young people exiting homelessness. It's very much the same kind of as the causes. There's that lack of supports, it's that prejudice, the discrimination, and again, accessing appropriate housing for their age group. So the vulnerable cohorts, this is what I referred to earlier on. There are 6 vulnerable cohorts identified within the strategy. So they are care leavers, people with disabilities, young parents, especially those parenting alone, members of the traveller community, members of the LGBTI+ community, and also individuals leaving prison services. So what we've done with each of these vulnerable cohorts is we've identified specific actions that would really suit the particular cohort and the needs of these cohorts. So each cohort gets at least one distinct action to support them. And of course, all of the actions within the strategy would also apply to them as well. So I'm going to just over the next couple of slides give you some examples of actions that fall under each strategic aim. So our first aim there is to prevent young people entering homelessness. And every time I give this presentation, I always stress, and I can't stress enough, that prevention is our number one priority within our homelessness policy unit. We don't want young people, we don't want any ages entering homelessness in the first instance. So it's really important for us to put in place as many prevention measures as possible. So just to give some examples there of the actions under this aim, I think we have about 12 actions under our first strategic aim. So develop information and awareness campaigns specifically targeting young people. And again, that speaks to Kate's point about how young people may be unsure of, what's available to them, how to access housing, how to access those supports, whether they're financial or possibly we also talk about education supports, employment supports as well. Our second action there that we're given as an example is to develop and implement homeless prevention programs for young people. So I think we've tasked the local authorities with this particular action, and we're going to work really closely with the local authorities to get this off the ground and hopefully have some form of pilot running before the end of the year. The third example I've given there, this is one of our actions that's specifically for one of our vulnerable cohorts. So in 2014, my own section within the department issued a circular to the local authorities, and it's setting out the protocol on young people leaving state care, because it was even acknowledged back then that young people leaving state care are at a heightened risk of entering homelessness. So that circular, it's nearly 10 years old at this stage, so it's really timely to review it, update it, and we're going to work really closely with TUSLA and Department of Children to ensure that that's accurate and up to date. And I think that might be for 2024, but we're going to start work on that this year. Our second strategic aim is to improve the experiences of young people in homelessness. As I said, prevention is always our priority, but the reality is that there are quite a high number of young people in emergency accommodation at the moment, and it's really important that they have an adequate experience there, that they get the supports that will help them to exit homelessness. So some of the actions there that I've set out as examples: examine the establishment of a framework for specific assessments for young people presenting to services. Again, that's something that we've tasked our local authorities with doing, and we will work really closely with them to ensure that framework gets put in place as soon as possible. Our second action there, establish further dedicated emergency accommodation for young people. Like I said, we don't want our young people in emergency accommodation in the first place, but it's really important to us that they do have that safe space, that if they are in emergency accommodation, that they're not sharing that space with people who may be significantly older than them, who may be entrenched in homelessness and have really complex either mental health or addiction issues. So what we want to do is establish dedicated emergency accommodation for this cohort. The third action that we're given as an example there is to review the availability of mental health supports for young people in emergency accommodation and to implement any recommendations that arise out of that review. So the HSE have responsibility for that particular action, and that's scheduled to commence in 2024. So the third strategic aim there is to assist young people exiting homelessness. So we're looking at piloting the use of social housing as shared accommodation for young people. Again, as Kate said, it can work. It's to mimic the life experiences of young people that typically they would share with peers. So we're looking to see how we can do that with the support of the local authorities. Our second action there, produce a guide setting out supports for young people exiting homelessness. So the housing agency are taking the lead on this action, and it kind of ties into the information campaigns that we mentioned under strategic aim 1. It's all about providing the right information for young people. Again, it's like that one-stop shop kind of idea where they can access the information really easily, all in one place. There are, as I said earlier, there are a lot of supports out there. There is a lot of information out there, but it's knowing how to access it. And so that the organizations at the moment, we do find there is a tendency to operate in silos, but this is bringing all the information together and presenting it in one kind of easy to read guide for young people. And I think this may also serve those who are at risk of homelessness. So we're looking to publish this guide in Q3 of this year. Our final action that I've given as an example there is to develop a pilot model of a housing-led intervention for young people. So this will be known as supported housing for youth. So I have a couple of slides on this particular action. It's probably the biggest action in our strategy, and it's a really important one. And we're working on that at the moment and hoping to pilot it before the end of the year. So just to explain what it is, it's a housing-led intervention for young people who are homeless or who are identified as a vulnerable cohort within the strategy and who may be at risk of homelessness. So I've just set out on the right-hand side of this slide kind of the key principles or features of SHI. So it will provide a range of accommodation options, including shared accommodation and one-bed units, assessment of supports required on a case-by-case basis. So the idea is that each client of SHI will have their own caseworker to work through their needs and to support them in whatever way they need to be supported. A really key feature of SHI, and this is something we always stress because that's where it may be slightly different from Housing First for Youth programs, is that there is time limited participation. So the aim is that the client gets to a position where they can live independently. So as I said, we've started work on developing SHI at the moment, and it's kind of being done in phases. So we're very much exploring how it's going to work in practice now at the moment. So we've had really productive discussions on eligibility criteria and supports, conditions of SHI, and that supported transition and peace, which is really important because, as I said, we talk about time limited participation, but we don't want to have that cliff edge that they talk about where if they're in SHI for 18 months, we don't want them to leave SHI and have the risk of re-entering emergency accommodation. So we also look very carefully at how we can support them to move out of SHI and onto whether it's a HAP tenancy in the private market or whether it's a social housing tenancy. We're exploring all those options now. So we've had these 3 discussions with the steering group, and I'll talk about the steering group shortly. That's on my next slide, but also some other key stakeholders, so people from around Ireland who have expertise in running similar programs. So we're just getting all the ideas at the moment, doing brainstorming sessions. What that has led to is the agreement that we should have an in-person stakeholder workshop. So that is due to take place next month, and we're just kind of finalising the details of that this week. And what we'll do is we'll bring 50 stakeholders in together and have further brainstorming sessions and to really kind of finalise and hone in on what the details and what SHI should really look like once it gets to that pilot stage. So the steering group that I mentioned, that was established shortly after the strategy was published last year, and it's been up and running really since January of this year. So all the key stakeholders are represented on the steering group. We have my own department, Department of Children. We have 2 representatives from the local authorities. We also have representatives from TUSLA, the HSE, the Housing Agency. We have 1 NGO member from the National Homeless Action Committee. We also have 1 individual who is representing representing the youth organisations in Ireland. So that nomination was sought and received from the Irish Coalition to End Youth Homelessness. So all the key stakeholders are there, and we meet on a very regular basis. It is meant to be quarterly, but we end up meeting far more often because there is so much to go through at the moment. But we're getting really good support and really good cross collaboration from this steering group. So I think that, yeah, that's my final slide. So I'm happy to take any questions now.
Okay, so I think Kate will come back as well, and we'll open it up to the Q&A. I can also use my position as chair and take advantage of all the knowledge on the Zoom. But we have an early question, and I think I have a version of this. So the question that was asked is a housing supply crisis, in a housing supply crisis, is there less appetite to develop effective coalition groups? And I suppose that speaks to as well the challenge of maintaining momentum in the context of a housing crisis, when really to move people on from homelessness you need a housing supply. So how do you maintain momentum and maintain the coalition groups when it can seem so difficult to provide move on? Or is that in itself an impetus? And maybe I'll give Kate a chance to come in first, and then maybe Sinead, if you want to, your insight as well.
I think what's really interesting is when we started Away Home Scotland and we contacted agencies that weren't housing and homelessness agencies and invited them around the table, they were like, are you sure it's us you want? It was almost like, it's not my job. So actually it was harder then. I think the housing crisis actually means that it's on more people's radar, therefore more people want to take action on it. And people now realise they can't do that alone and they need to work together. So I think actually people are more keen to come up with alternative solutions because it's not as easy as just getting a house anymore. There's got to be some support and some action taken to access it. And I think most of our housing solutions have been in partnership. So our Housing First programmes in partnership with the Housing Association, our rent deposit programmes in partnership with Safe Deposit Scotland, even the implementation of our pathways is with the government and many agencies. So I think there's, I think when times are tougher, people will get together more to come up with creative solutions. And we've seen that in other coalitions growing as well.
Okay. Sinead?
Yeah, no, I'll echo Kate's point. I do think it's in those tougher times that people do tend to come together. And I think when the Irish Coalition were formed, if that was 2017, if I'm correct in my year there, like, I mean, that was, you could really see like the constraints on supply were really having an effect on like people getting tenancies, particularly young people, and you could really see those numbers starting to climb then for young people. And I know, just like, I mean, as soon as I joined the homelessness policy section, so I've been in the department 7 years, and I worked, I joined the homelessness policy unit in 2021, and very shortly after me joining, the coalition reached out to introduce themselves and make themselves known, and absolutely they're working so effectively, and we've had so much engagement with the coalition, and I do think the strategy is richer because of that engagement, and we've had really good, you know, conversations around it.
Okay. I think one of the questions I was interested, because you both touched on the fact that we want to make sure that if a young person has an experience of homelessness, that, you know, that the services are of a standard that help progress rather than any kind of falling back or exacerbation of any underlying issues that might be there or might actually be caused by poor quality accommodation. But I suppose there's also the question of, you know, there's that classic housing first graph that I think, Kate, in your slides, where you have, you know, you want big prevention and big move on, and then emergency should be the least of it, but good quality for what's there. But I suppose one of the dangers, or one of the concerns, is always that in the context of the housing crisis, while we have great intentions for the other two, is that ultimately we end up relying more and more on emergency accommodation. And how do we arrest or hold back on perhaps a leaning into the old answers of, you know, if young people were to start rough sleeping, the answer to that seem to be emergency accommodation. So as the crisis, if a crisis deepens, how do you hold the prevention and move on side when there can sometimes be a maybe a political impetus to open more emergency? And how do you hold the ground on that? Kate?
I'm not saying we've got it solved yet. We're definitely making progress on it. But I think that, so for the Scottish Government, when they decided to go for a strategy of rapid rehousing, they actually put a fund in, so almost offered funding to create housing first while still dealing with crisis, in the hope that some of that crisis could be shrunk a little bit by offering housing first as one of the solutions and offering rapid rehousing actions. So we have to keep doing that to make till we get the balance right. And we talk about this a lot. It's about there are limited resources available for all of it. And it's how we push resources more into prevention rather than crisis. And that's a bit of a balancing act because you can't do one without the other, right? And we're still working through that. But certainly an offering more secure move-on options so people aren't doing the revolving door of coming back into homelessness. And making sure the support there is right to make that happen has been really, really important. And what we've seen for young people is also the skill building. So often the social networks programs like mentoring and mediation, befriending programs, it's social connections that build resilience and skills for young people so they don't become homeless again in the future. And we've seen those things work really well to ensure we're not seeing repeat homelessness.
Okay. And so I just see the questions come in, which is, I think, an extension of the theme we were just exploring there. So the question specifically is, can we ask Kate how they transition from emphasis on crisis intervention to prevention in Scotland? I think we covered some of that, but at the same time addressing immediate need. And I think they've picked up on the fact, Sinead, you've spoken about the priority of prevention here, and it's an absolute priority. Yet we're talking about developing more emergency accommodation specifically for the cohort. So the SHI model isn't to develop models that would be considered a permanent home that the person could use for as long as they wanted, and move on to a bit like CAS for care leavers as an example. So how are we? I suppose, is there a consciousness of that? But it's rather it's back to that thing of, we want it to be used as rarely as possible, but when it is, that it's appropriate. But not to, again, it's about how do we hold back from moving into just developing more emergency accommodation. So just any further reflection. Sinead, I might bring you in, because I think Kate has answered some of this. But Kate, you can come back in if you have more time.
Sure. Yeah. So absolutely. I'll say again, prevention absolutely is a priority, but what we found when we had the consultation specifically with the young people was that they spoke about being really frightened and vulnerable in sharing emergency accommodation with people who have really complex needs. And this is where this action is coming from, that the unfortunate reality is that young people are in emergency accommodation. So it's really important that they have the appropriate space while they're there. So when we talk about developing more emergency accommodation, that's very specifically for young people, and it's that they're not in those kind of more general emergency accommodation spaces, that if they do find themselves in a situation where they are homeless and they need to access that emergency accommodation, that they have a safe space. So Wayne, you'll probably be aware of this, like we issued guidance in, I think it was September last year, and that set out how new emergency accommodation should be developed. And we had a very specific section just in the context of the strategy also being developed about new emergency accommodation specifically for young people. And we spoke about it having this dedicated space for young people to, if they want to, family mediation, that they have that space. So they have a kind of a meeting space within their emergency accommodation area. And not all emergency accommodation, unfortunately, has that, but it was really important for us that they do have that dedicated space to meet with their families or whoever they're in contact with, but also that they can avail of training and support sessions there so that people can come in to provide information on what supports are available to help them exit that little bit faster from emergency accommodation.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
I would say that I agree in that, like Sinead, having alternative for young people specific accommodation is definitely a good thing, and quite often if the right programs are there, the skill building, and whether it is about mediation and family supports or whether it's about skill building for the future, I think it's important that young people have a separate space to adults. And it is just about making sure that that remains emergency accommodation for emergencies. And it's back to this idea, we talk about it a lot, don't we? If you see, you know, weather, floods, whatever, and you see families and communities being moved into the gym hall. If they're still in the gym hall 6 months, a year later, you'd be asking questions. So similarly, I think with any of the emergency accommodation, it's about how you make sure there's a move-on pathway from that so that they don't get stuck there and end up being quite long-term rather than emergency accommodation.
Yeah, and I think that probably is part of the answer. It's also the job of organisations like Scotland, but also the Coalition to End Youth Homelessness to monitor that kind of how long are people spending in these accommodation. That's a very good barometer, I think. I suppose the anxiety in the Irish context is what we've seen with family homelessness, where there was a big push before Sinead's time. There was a big push to develop the hubs as a better form of accommodation than putting people up in hotels and B&Bs, particularly families in particular, up in hotels and hubs would create that additional space. But what we've seen is a focus on developing hubs that saw them increase. And this is all in the context of obviously the enormous housing crisis that we have here in Ireland at the moment and how acute that is. But I think that's that transition to opening more and more hubs has developed a momentum that was really unfortunate. And I think that's what's to be guarded against. But I think knowing it and guarding against it is part of is written into the strategy, and that's where the strategy developed to its potential is.
And the pandemic didn't help, right? Because the pandemic restrained house building and house renovation and bringing houses back into use. So I think the pandemic really exacerbated that for us here in Scotland. Can I just ask a question? I'm like, Sinead, the strategy looks really impressive, and clearly it's been very much considered from young people's point of view, which is amazing. And what do you see as the biggest challenges to actually implementing the plans?
I think it comes down to the point, and we did talk about like the number one cause of youth homelessness is family breakdowns. But we do have to acknowledge like these massive constraints in supply that are in Ireland at the moment. Like, I know from my point of view, like we're working on developing shy or supported housing for youth, and we're talking about acquiring the appropriate units, and like that in itself is a challenge. So it's that question of supply. But as simultaneously, I know my colleagues working in the delivery section are kind of really ramping up supply, and like they're introducing all these new measures that supply can increase. So if we can maintain that momentum of increase in supply, which supply has been increasing, if we can maintain that momentum, I think it'll go a long way in helping us deliver the actions within the strategy.
And I suppose that's, if I could, just a final question, because I think you've actually hit on something really important there, which is as that supply comes on, it's how do we apportion that supply to make sure that it's young people that's getting it, because obviously they're usually the ones who get left behind because they're the shortest time on housing list, and they're usually time-based housing. So I'm just wondering, Kate, in terms of what you've done in Scotland, a big part of it has been the success of the collaboration. And I think one of the things we're seeing, or looking at it as an NHAC member and seeing the reports from Sinead and the work that's being done on the steering group, that collaboration is building momentum in the Irish context. But for someone who, my sense of it is maybe a bit further on in that collaboration in Scotland, what do you think was how do you keep people on board and keep that momentum when the pressures in their own system around, making sure there's accommodation for older people, making sure there's accommodation for the general housing list, and how do you capture some of that stock to make sure that young people are the focus when that notion of transition is often built into youth?
Well, it's interesting because Sinead talked about raising awareness amongst young people of how to access housing and housing advice and support. And I think that's important, but I think more important is to actually talk to the sector. We talked a lot to the homelessness and housing sector, so our own colleagues, to say youth homelessness is different, let's deal with it differently. And we also talked people out with the sector to say why homelessness was their business. So it's, when you look at the collective impact, our education system, they have one of their big aims is to ensure that young people leave school to positive destinations. And we went to the schools and said that's impossible unless they're housed. Let's look at housing as part of that positive destination. So it was trying to make sure you aligned it with everyone else's strategies and needs, to make sure that they saw solving the housing and homelessness issue as one of their aims. So bringing people on board by, I guess, aligning needs and making sure that that in itself kept momentum going. And we involved young people, having the voices of young people on that journey. So we sit with the Scottish Government's leadership group to monitor homelessness in Scotland, and we have young people that sit on that group with us and talk about their experiences and what those numbers actually mean. And I think that's given a real big impact to the sector and beyond.
That's brilliant. And that brings us to exactly 11 o'clock. So I'm going to, I should just say that our next month, unusually for us, we already know exactly who it's going to be. So it's the topic will be on health outcomes for people in housing first, and some research that the HSE has been involved in, which I think should be a good one. So put that in the diary. And with that, I just want to thank Kate and Sinead on what I found to be a really stimulating discussion. I know Sinead is obviously, we talk relatively regularly about the Youth Homelessness Strategy in Ireland, but I think even in this context, I've gotten more out of it. So thank you for such a comprehensive presentation. And to Kate, as always, thank you for congratulations on your excellent work, and thank you for such an engaging presentation from you as well. So with that, we'll close. Thank you very much.